welcome back to my channel. Maybe you don't notice or care. The hair is crooked, the eyeliner might be crooked, the shirt might be crooked. Bodies are not symmetrical, it's fine. Today I'm going to be doing my wrap-up of all the books I read in February. I read 10 books, which, even accounting for it being the shortest month of the year, might be the least number of books that I've read since I've been filming wrap-ups. So that's interesting. Which, now that we're like halfway through March when I'm filming this, I'm like, oh yeah, the seasonal depression and, you know, the 1-year anniversary of being out of work it's having an effect, even if I didn't quite notice it was there. But, anyway, but still, like, 10 books is still, like, plenty. So let's get into it. All right. I remember going through my notes and thinking about, like, the first book I read and being like, oh my god, that was so long ago. But it was only, like, 6 weeks ago. Anyway, okay. I read 10 books. Book number 1 was the audiobook of We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is a climate change nonfiction that I picked up on recommendation from Lena Norms. This is one that I actually wrote a little bit of a review on after reading some of the other reviews. The reviews were talking about it like it was a book that was about convincing you to go vegan, and I'm like, no, that's not what it is. It's not about convincing you to go vegan. It's not. It's a book about the philosophical crisis of, we know that changing what we eat is the most effective, most accessible, most immediate thing that we as individuals can do to address climate change. Why don't we do it? Why? Like, and the, you know, the call to action that he does have in there is like, how about no meat before dinner? You can still have meat, just only for dinner. Like, can you do that? What? Can you try? And then, like, beyond that, he's like, you know, don't worry about, like, changing your diet totally. What about just the meal you're going to have right now? What if you just chose a vegan or vegetarian meal right now? Don't worry about the rest. This one. Why not? Why? So, you know, that's kind of like the conversation that the whole book circles around. But then it goes into a lot of, like, human behavior and, like, other things in history that kind of parallel this. We are facing this looming crisis. We know exactly what it is. We know what's causing it, and we know what can help. So why, when faced with, you should do this, do we just not? And I also really liked his response to, I think it was a comment from, what's his name? I have a book by him. A response about Stephen Hawking claiming that, like, humans are going to outgrow the planet. So we should, like, learn how to survive in space or on other planets. And the author has this response of, what kind of future would you predict for a civilization that abandons its home? People who think of home as dispensable will be able to think of anything as dispensable and will become a dispensable people. And that kind of ties into this other theme of, like, you know what, like, our current way of life, we can never preserve it. Like, our current rate of consumption, the rate, you know, the mass amounts of livestock, agriculture, just like our current way of life is not sustainable. We can't do it. So how about we accept that, grieve it if you have to, but learn how to live in whatever the new normal needs to be. Human beings are very creative and adaptable, and we can live in whatever future is thrown at us, but we have to be real about what are we going to need to do. And I think my favorite part of this book, which I can imagine it would be difficult to read, but listening to it, and I'm pretty sure it's narrated by the author, listening to it was really interesting. And it's like the author arguing with himself, and there's a lot of like, how about you do this? Well, I can't do that. Well, why? Because I don't want to. Why don't you want to? Well, what about this? What about it? And it's an interesting, very calm, but very, like, mental exercise interesting argument. But I think, actually, I always think about it when I see people doing, like, whataboutism. Which, if you don't know what that is, it's, you know, people trying to invalidate your argument by bringing in all of this extra stuff. And instead of, like, answering it, like, make them answer it. It's like, well, what about this? Well, what about it? You brought it up. You tell me. Why is that important? Don't try and tell me why it's relevant. Don't skate around the issue. So it's a book about climate change, and primarily around, like, the impacts of livestock, agriculture, and human impact. But I would say it's like, you know, a level 2 book where it's like, okay, you have read about the science, you've read the statistics, like, you know the facts, but now let's talk about, like, the emotions and the psychology that is relevant to why are we still destroying our planet? Like, why is it difficult to make changes? And I found it, like, really comforting. I think it does kind of meander a little bit, and I don't think this book's going to be for everyone, but I found it really comforting to actually, like, by proxy, like, have a conversation about, like, why does the easy thing feel so hard? So I did technically participate in Blackathon, and I have, like, a little post on it on my Instagram that I put up on, like, the last day of February. I did participate in the sense of, like, my TBR for the month was influenced by the prompts, but then, like, I never got around to, like, making a video or doing any of the video tags or anything because, you know, seasonal depression and shit. But I do have 4 books on here that were influenced by these prompts. So the first book I picked up was The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. So I read this for the science fiction fantasy prompt Octavia Butler, time travel is a major component. So this book is more about, like, traveling between dimensions, but some of the dimensions are, like, ahead or behind in time. They're not all, like, exactly lined up, so there is technically time travel in there. The word that I kept coming back to while reading this, I really fucking enjoyed it. This was, like, a 5-star for me. The word I kept coming back to was exquisite. This is, like, a really imaginative take on portraying corporate greed and, like, the ethical dilemma when science is now supported by profit. And also it examines, like, the true cost of escaping the circumstances you were born into. One of my favorite lines from the book is our protagonist saying something like, you know, I've done terrible things, but I would never go back and I'm not ashamed. I don't remember exactly what it was because memory like a goldfish, but anyway, so that ties into, I fucking loved our protagonist, Kara. She has earned her very, like, calm ruthlessness. Like, she's earned it. Like, sometimes the decisions that she makes are really uncomfortable, but I would think, like, most readers can't help but see an aspect of themselves in her because she's the embodiment of humanity's determination to survive and maybe get to a place where she's not just surviving but also thriving. But then we have to look at, not just in her world, but in every single world that she's ever been to that has been, like, denied to her. And it's beautiful. And a lot of people talk about, like, the sapphic romance in this, which is there, but it's really not the focus. So if you're someone who's like, I'm not really into, like, romance in my books, like, it's not central. Like, the relation, you know, the tension between her and her potential love interest is really interesting, especially once we start figuring out, like, how things have been misread and what's been contributing or hindering it. But it's not about, like, you know, it's not like this Romeo and Juliet thing of these two lovers who, like, can't be together. Loved it. Yes, great. The next book I finished was Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So if you're new here, I'm kind of on an astrophysics nonfiction kick. I've been reading a couple of books like that in my past reviews. I would say that this is definitely not astrophysics for beginners. I relied heavily on, the bits of knowledge that I gleaned in Isaac Asimov's The Universe and Carl Sagan's Cosmos. So, there was a lot in here where I'm like, what? Especially because there's no pictures. There's no pictures, no diagrams or anything in here. So some of these concepts are really difficult to explain just with words. So that is kind of like one of my not great things about it is like, I really think at least give me a couple of diagrams. That's really helpful. But I was able to like kind of grasp. I never felt completely lost, which felt good. And compared to the other ones I've read, this one definitely explores some of the more modern aspects of astrophysics. Like, what is astrophysics working on now? Things like dark matter, dark energy, what's going on in the space between planets, between galaxies. And you can definitely tell in this book that Tyson is a student of Carl Sagan in the sense that throughout this, there is this acknowledgement of the awesome beauty and logic of the universe. It's not just about, like, the math and the physics, but it's also like, this shit is so wild and so fucking cool. And let's just be nerds who love how cool it is. And let's have joy in pursuing what we don't know. I had this really intense revelation while reading this, so I'm going to have to give you some context. So there was a quote in here about Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein hardly ever set foot in the laboratory. He didn't test phenomena or use elaborate equipment. He was a theorist who perfected the thought experiment in which you engage nature through your imagination by inventing a situation or model and then working out the consequences of some physical principle. In Germany before World War II, laboratory-based physics far outranked the theoretical physics in the minds of most Aryan scientists. Jewish physicists were all relegated to the lowly theorist sandbox and left to fend for themselves, and what a sandbox that would become. So the reason that Albert Einstein was in the kind of field that he was because of racism. And this kind of shattered my brain because I was so excited to pick this up because I was thinking about, when we think of like nonfiction written by Black authors, like I have a really hard time thinking of anything that's not focused on racism, politics, trauma, anything that's so like this book by Neil deGrasse Tyson, he was like the only person I could think of who was known in a field where I thought, race didn't have to come into play. And with that paragraph, he kind of was like, no, that's not true. Racism and discrimination still heavily influences our scientific findings. And I've also started watching, it's on Hulu, Cosmos, Possible Worlds, which is also narrated by Sagan. And in that one, they talk a lot about various scientists and their backgrounds. And, we're not just talking about their science, but we're talking about like, well, they were excommunicated from their faith because of this kind of tension. Or, well, they died in a concentration camp because they were Jewish. Or, their work was never published because of this and this and this. And so here I was just thinking like, wondering and feeling comforted in the idea that, okay, once you escape like the Earth's atmosphere, the universe doesn't fucking care about like petty human squabbles. Maybe petty is not really the right word because people's lives are at stake, but also like the universe doesn't fucking care. But, that really made me realize that, while, the math of it, the physics of it might not really care, our ability to discover these things is very heavily influenced by, what people have access to what and who gets funding and who gets listened to. that was an amazing? Maybe amazing's not, maybe amazing feels like too lighthearted, but like it was a very fucking fascinating revelation of just being like, oh no, it's everywhere. You know, racism and discrimination influence abso-fucking-lutely everything. Anyway, I liked it. I would read more. Also, I fucking want to watch all of the Cosmos series. Space. I love it. That's a really trite summary, but there we go. The next book I finished was Castle, the second book in the Seventh Tower series by Garth. This is a middle grade fantasy series that I am rereading. I really liked how this built further on the world that was established in book 1, The Fall. We get a little bit more time with our characters and they're wondering what's going on. That was kind of my gripe in the first one, where it's like all these awful things are happening to this young boy, but we never really get time to think about like and acknowledge that this shit's really awful and what the fuck is going on. But in this one, yeah, we get to kind of dwell on the what the fuck nature of what's going on, and also build like the complex hidden history of this world. There was an odd choice in here where we follow our male protagonist Tal for most of the book, and then suddenly, like, I don't know, like 2/3 of the way through the book, now we have a chapter that starts with Mila's perspective, which, I mean, does kind of set up with them getting separated and then, you know, seeing what happens with each of them prospectively while they're trying to find each other. But it was just really weird that the narrative wasn't more even to begin with. Anyway, I enjoyed it. I'll finish the series, especially because I own them, and I love the fantasy worlds that Garth comes up with. The next book I finished was the audiobook of the first volume of Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This was a book for the Blackathon prompt. Tade Thompson, a black protagonist, encounters an alien civilization or technology. Oh, I wish it was easier to take notes while listening to an audiobook, especially because like this is a novella, so it was really short. So our protagonist Binti is from the Himba people. So in this story, these people in this futuristic Earth world, they are known for being talented and advanced mathematicians, but culturally they do not travel away from Earth. And Binti gets accepted into a prestigious space academy, and she has to make the decision to leave her homeland in order to pursue her passion and her interests. And I think this is also something where I kind of wish I had like a physical book. I think there's something like magical or like super futurist in the way that they do their calculations. There's something about like, I started to tree, but because I was listening, I couldn't see how it was spelled. So anyway, this is something that I feel like I want to see this written out, because just listening to it, especially like while I'm like doing other things, I was kind of like, wait, it feels like it sounds like they go into some kind of like specialized trance in order to do these calculations, but like not being able to go back and like reread like a certain section where that happens and make sure I understand what's going on, I came away a little bit like, what's happening? I don't know. So I got a little bit of a spoiler. I'm going to put my hand up while I'm talking about it, and hopefully I don't forget that that's why I'm doing this. I'm going to keep it kind of vague if you don't want to skip, but what I'm talking about is a bit of a spoiler. So I absolutely fucking love that the thing that allows Binti to connect with the alien race, the Meduse, is her ochise. And it's established in the story through many microaggressions from other characters that this cultural tradition is something that opens her up to a lot of discrimination and misjudgment. But also in the story, the tentative peace with the Meduse couldn't come about without it. And I think there's something really necessary in that theme, in taking something that normally sets you apart in an uncomfortable way, but turning it into something that is really valuable and necessary, not just for you, but like for everyone around you, even if they themselves are not involved in it. I don't really know how to explain it better than that, but there's something really interesting and beautiful in that. So this is great. I would love to continue with the series. I did really like the narration, but I feel like at least there's a couple of volumes in this. At least one of the... Oh, I don't need this anymore. Anyway, I would like to continue with the series. I think at least I want to pick up a volume or two, either ebook or physical. Okay. The next book I finished was The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull. This was the group read for Blackathon for the science fiction fantasy group team. That's the word I want. This was really, really interesting, and I'm glad that we chose this because, or not we, I'm glad it was chosen for us to read. This is really interesting. I don't know if I would have picked it up by myself, but it was really interesting. So this takes place on the U.S. Virgin Islands, the initial part of the book is a setup in the time before first contact with the aliens, the Nnedi, and then the rest of the book takes place like 5 years later after contact with the Nnedi. I've noticed a lot of other people reviewing this book call it like a character study more than plot driven, which I kind of agree. But I think it's also more thematically driven, because there's this really strong commentary on the nature of colonialism explored through the events of alien presence. One of the reasons that I think it's more like thematically driven is there's just like this one sentence, but I feel like it sums up a lot of the tensions and a lot of the character relationships in this book. Is these two characters are talking about the Nnedi, and one person says like when they invaded, and the other person says they didn't invade, they arrived. And that's, I think, a really interesting conversation, because like they technically arrived peacefully, and they are technically don't mean us harm, and technically the Nnedi, they've given us like really advanced medical science to like treat cancer. Like there's a lot about them that seems benevolent, but because of the way that they respond to any kind of aggression with just blatant violence, and not just they respond with violence, but there is this imbalance of physical and status power. So it's like this question of like, can peace exist with such an imbalance of power? Even though they mean well, they have so much power that human beings really have no way to defend themselves. So like, is that peaceful? Is that benevolent? Even if they mean well. Yeah, I really liked it. I had a little bit of a problem, like problem seems like a strong word, but a little bit of like a, towards like the end of the book, where we were introduced to 2 additional storylines for these other characters, and like one of them seems more relevant, and then the other one is like, it's just kind of set up for an action they do later. But I'm kind of like, I don't feel like they were developed well enough for their significance. I don't know, it was weird. It was like the author suddenly had this idea that couldn't be done without introducing some new characters, but it was kind of like too late in the book to introduce them earlier. So it was just, there was just a little bit of like, okay, but why are we suddenly learning about these characters now? But overall, I liked it, and I definitely would be interested in checking out other works by this author. I think this was a debut novel, I think. So I'll just keep an eye out for what else they come out with in the future. The next book I finished was Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky by Kwame Mbalia. This is a middle grade fantasy, and I read this to fill the Blackathon prompt. Rita Woods, a character traverses the spirit realm or heavily embodies black spirituality. So this was a reluctant hero adventure with many characters pulled from Black American folklore, such as Brer Rabbit, John Henry, Anansi, and Gum Baby. So I know it's a middle grade, but the writing had some rough edges that kind of bothered me. Like, it kind of like feels like a running joke of the main character saying, when when he encounters something that kind of blows his mind and he just like can't speak. And it's like doing that like once or twice is okay, interesting. Because I kind of understand the whole like, I've been plunged into like a magical folklore world. What the fuck is going on? Huh. But there was at least one chapter where like everyone keeps like asking him for a response and he just says that exclamation like 5 times. And I made a note of like, repetition doesn't convince me that the stakes are high. And I think there were other moments in the book like that where like the author just kind of kept repeating like a phrase or an action or an exclamation. But, the repetition of something does not equal convincing me that it's important. Just because you say it a lot doesn't mean that I understand why it's important. I mean, this could have also been like seasonal depression fucking with like my focus, but so disclaimer for all of that. If I like didn't pick up on something or if I harp on some kind of detail, my brain is a chaotic mess right now. It's okay. It's okay. So that disclaimer aside, I also felt like the journey felt a little messy. At one point we do like a major backtrack thing and I'm like, I felt like we either spend like too much in one place or like not enough in one place. I don't know. There was just something I wasn't really on board with. And I also have to acknowledge that this is based on a lot of folklore that I'm really unfamiliar with and I don't really have a lot of connection to. I'm not the target audience. It's okay. But it makes me like hesitant to judge it like a little too harshly because I don't really have the right context. I'm glad to have read it. Like, it was fun, but I definitely feel like this is written for like middle school Black kids, especially like Black boys. So I just might be one too many points of a demographic removed to really appreciate it, and that's okay. I still enjoyed it. I have the comment of like, I thought it was better than, but it reminded me a lot of Children of Blood and Bone, where I think its popularity or like its a lot of the hype around its publication is based more on a thirst for this kind of representation than necessarily the quality of it. Because I feel like it has just like a lot of tropes that are popular in like YA and middle grade fiction right now, but it's Black folklore with Black main characters, which like is fine. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with like doing the thing that's popular, but aiming it at an underrepresented demographic. But it also felt like that's kind of all that was happening. Anyway, if you've read this, or if you've read this and you have different thoughts, I absolutely want to know. Anyway, summary. I'm glad to have read it. I didn't really think it was for me. It's fine. Okay, the next one I finished. This is one of the books that took me a really long time to finish. It was like the longest 400 pages of my life. That is Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. Lindqvist? What is he? Swedish? So this is a Swedish vampire horror novel. And this one, like, I wrote a review for, and I gave it 3 stars, like, not because I feel meh about anything, but because there are some things I really like, and some things I really don't, and there's not a lot of feelings in the middle. I think, like, even accounting for the fact that I'm not a huge fan of horror and, like, very dark characters, I think, like, what I like and what I didn't like is still, like, valid. This story is graphic and gross and bleak and at times very slow, and it's way too long. I'll get into it. But it's also like beautiful and meticulously crafted, and like the last 20% of the book was like, yes, I wish it had like this kind of energy throughout all of it. So things I liked. I liked that the vampire lore in this book had a distinction between undead vampires and an infected living person. I think this story touches on what horror can do really well, which is the parallels between paranormal and human monsters. So there's a lot of discussion of monstrosity you know, within someone who's a vampire and within someone who's a human. And also, like, the potential for monstrosity that lives in all of us. I really love the relationship between Oscar and Eli. I think it's Eli. Initially, I was thinking it was Eli, but then there's other things in the book, and I think it's Eli. Even though I would think Ellie, because that's what I think of as a feminine name. Anyway, the relationship between Oscar and Eli was tender and beautiful and fulfilling, but appropriately tense and morally ambiguous. And like the overall bleak, chilling mood of the novel was great. Things I did not like. This book was way too long. There was way too much investment in side characters and subplots. Like, the whole Virginia story should have been its own book. Like, I see how it relates to what's going on here, but, like, we could have cut that whole story out. And I think the value of the book would have remained intact. I really wanted to like the non-binary gender expression. I don't want to, like, talk about it too much because it's a spoiler. But, anyway... But there is, like, some discussion of, like, non-binary, non-heteronormative gender things going on. Ultimately, I think there was too much association between non-cisgendered bodies and monstrosity. So it's like, I wanted to like it, but I don't think the author was writing it in a way that I was actually comfortable with. Also, this is translated from Swedish. I should have looked up what language it is. It's translated. It's not a great translation. A lot of phrases are clunky. I found typos. I found segments that I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's the wrong word. I'm pretty sure that, like, you chose the wrong word in translating it. Like, it's not great. Anyway. But I have to talk about, like, why I picked this book up. Like, yes, I love vampire mythology, but I'm not really into, like, horror novels. But I picked this up because I saw the stage adaptation that was on tour from the National Theatre of Scotland, and that was one of my favorite theatrical experiences I have ever been to. And that one cuts down the story really, really tightly. Like, the whole, like, pedophilia subplot, I'm pretty sure that is, like, 99% of that is cut out. Of course, there's going to be, like, some pedophilia themes with, like, an adult taking care of a vampire who presents as a child. But the stage adaptation was very much focused on, like, Oscar and Eli. And they incorporated a lot of, like, movement studies. So it wasn't quite dance, but there was a lot of, like, using movement to convey emotions and things. And it was really effective when Eli was doing vampire things. And, like, the sound design of that thing was fucking amazing. And, like, the movement stuff was also really effective because, like, I remember I was sitting, like, all the way in the back of this theater, so I couldn't really read facial expressions, but with their very intentional, like, body blocking movements, I could understand everything that was conveyed because it didn't just rely on facial expressions. So, anyway, so I'm glad I picked up the book because I really, really loved the stage adaptation. I haven't seen either of the movies. I don't know if I will. Alright, so book number 9. I picked up the audiobook of Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. This was a new release in February. This is the prequel to The Hate U Give. It follows Maverick when he is a 17-year-old teenage father. I feel like I don't want to consume any Angie Thomas book except on audiobook because not just are, like, the narrators so good, but the way she writes gives such a strong voice to her characters that it just translates really, really well to being a story that you consume by listening. Of course, because I have listened to The Hate U Give, I'm already very connected and invested in these characters because I kind of have a sense of, like, where they end up, like, 20 years from now, or, like, 16 years from now. I fucking love Maverick as our protagonist. His character growth is so strong, so amazing. Like, Of course, a 17-year-old is going to feel overwhelmed at being a new father, but the way he grows into that role is amazing to watch. You see, like, how dedicated he is to his child, how much he loves them. We still see, like, his immaturity at play with his temptation to go back to selling drugs to make money. Because, like, the lack of viable job opportunities where he lives, with him and his circumstances, is, like, a legitimate struggle. But we also see that because he's only 17, he can't really visualize the long-term consequences of an action like that. He is so consumed with his short-term priorities. And the priorities are valid. Like, so you're kind of like, no, don't do it. But I also, like, I totally understand why you are so tempted by this. I also really loved the tough love relationships from the adults in his life. They don't sugarcoat that his life is going to be fucking difficult because of the mistakes he's made. But they also don't want him to fail. They know he needs to grow up fast, and that means he can't be coddled when he slacks off. But you also see that, like, we're not going to let you fail. We're not going to let you fail. You know? Like, when you really fucking do need help, you have to ask. But if you ask, we'll figure something out. So yeah, the sense of, like, family and community of this setting is amazing, and I fucking love it. And I should have said, like, also, but there's also, like, a whole lot of trigger warnings in this book. You know, we've got gang violence, you know, reference to drug abuse, teen parenting, technically, like, child abandonment. Things are not easy. Things are not easy in his neighborhood, but I'm absolutely here for learning, like, the saga of, like, everyone in this family. And the last book I read in February, which I finished, like, you know, at 9 o'clock at night on the last day of the month, was Summer Night by Jim Butcher. This is the 4th book in the Dresden Files series that I am rereading. Most of it, I think I've read up through book, like, 11 or 12, like, 10 years ago. In this book, I'm starting to get tired of Messy Harry. Kind of, like, my reaction is like, yeah, dude, I know things suck and you're grieving, but you need to take a fucking shower. Which, you know, feels kind of shitty as someone with depression saying that, but also, like, it's been going on a while. And I know, and because I have read it before, I know that there's a point where he does kind of, like, get his shit together and, you know, adopt the self-discipline that combats what's really traumatic and difficult about his life. And I'm just kind of like, can we get there? Can we get to the point where he gets his magical puppy? I think that's 2 books away. Anyway, so I'm getting kind of tired with the, like, the woe is me part, but with that, there is some acknowledgement that unchecked pain and grief and loss can make monsters out of the best of us. So I do understand that, like, this suffering facade is a setup for some character development conversations. And there is, like, a moment where it kind of doesn't say explicitly, but there is, like, an event that happens that tells us that healing doesn't mean forgetting. But it's necessary to have actual moments of unfiltered, acknowledged grief rather than constantly sucking it up and letting it poison you. So that's, like, the interesting theme of what's going on in this 4th installment. In this installment, we meet the Wizards Council, which we get some attempts at ethnic diversity, but it's kind of clumsy and doesn't age too well. I mean, this book's written in 2009, and I feel like by then, we shouldn't have still been using the word Oriental to describe Asian people. I don't know. I felt weird about it. I felt weird about the way... I liked the Native American character. I did not really like how he was talked about. You get what I mean? And also, like with a lot of the books, there is quite a bit of, like, sexism in the form of objectification of female characters. Have to acknowledge it, because, like, it would kind of be a disservice to not acknowledge it. And something I realized was the casual sexism kind of bothers me more than the overt sexism. You know, like, okay, if we're in a scene where some sexy naked fairy lady is trying to seduce you, like, okay, yeah, it makes sense that you're going to describe, like, why you think she's sexy and what's going on with you. Like, that makes sense. But then there's this other scene, and this is the one that kind of made me think of it, was there's a character where we're talking about a necklace, and then there's like a line about like, and then, you know, it came to rest on a pair of modest breasts. And I just had a moment of like, dude, you did not need to bring breasts into it. You could have just said it's lying on her shirt or on her blouse or whatever. So it's like, that's the kind of shit that bothers me. You don't need to describe every woman as a potential sex object. Some of them are just women. I kind of sound like I didn't really enjoy this book too much. I mean, this is just like a super actiony urban fantasy. It's like it's one of my like junk food book series. I'm kind of like in a mood right now where I'm like, I'm gonna take a break from it for a while, just because I don't know. I'm in like a really reading book slump. I'm in a bit of a reading slump. I don't really know what I'm in the mood for. I know that this is not what I'm in the mood for the moment, and that's fine. I do at least want to read the next 2 books and get to where we get his dog, because his dog is great. Shush phone. His dog is great. To borrow a phrase from I just heard from Thoughts on Tomes, was it lives in my trash pocket, and it'll be there whenever I'm in the mood to get back to it. Anyway, that's the video. Those are all the books I read in the month of February. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have all of my various social media places linked in the description box below if you would like to follow me elsewhere. If you've missed my last video, which was a fucking lengthy closet declutter, I talk about a fundraiser for the Katamanto Market Fire Relief Fund. So that's also going to be linked in the description box below. Please check that out if you don't already know what that is. Anyway, I'll catch you on my next video. Bye!